Hey there, listeners. Well, I had a great interview with a guy called Brent Kedzierski, and Brent is an awesome guy and a wealth of knowledge. He's an internationally recognized thought leader in the realm of human-centered, connected worker ecosystems. And, the title of this episode is called Whole Person Leadership. We talked about them and us, but then we also talked about the ability to lead through influence, which is a huge thing for a lot of leaders who to understand but also to do is very important. Then we also talked about having balance around care and candor. Really cool conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
Hey there, listeners. Welcome to another wonderful episode of the Leadership is Changing podcast. Great to have you here with me today. I've got an awesome guest, and his name is Brent Kedzierski. Brent, a massive welcome to you.
Thank you, Dennis. Glad to be with you and sharing some time today.
Excellent. Now, the listeners love knowing where my guests are around the world, and whereabouts are you today?
I am in a little town called Oak Island, North Carolina.
North Carolina. Wow. Wow. I've never been to North Carolina. I've been to South Carolina, but not North Carolina. I look forward to doing that one day. And so the other thing I've got to ask you is I've given the listeners a little bit of an introduction to you, but we'd love to know more about you and your background. I understand that you're an internationally recognized thought leader in the realm of human-centered connected worker ecosystems, and also that you're a senior program manager. Tell us more about you and your background.
Sure, I grew up in Pittsburgh, in the suburb of Pittsburgh. I could look out my back window and my back porch of my house and see the smoke from the steel mills going. And my family had a long, long history since immigration, whether it was the Italian or Polish side, coming and being industrial workers, whether it was majority of steel workers, coal miners, railroad operators. And I really had that DNA growing up of shoveling coal in the furnace and punching spikes in the railroads and all those kind of things. And I did a lot of industrial jobs growing up in assembly lines, manufacturing plants. And it always gave me a big interest. And actually, I went to university for industrial organizational psych and training. And I really started like hit my way out of university. And I ended up doing all things in Washington, D.C., where I started working in human performance and leadership and change management and transformation and things like that.
Excellent. And I understand you've been in some publications too as well. Tell us more about them.
Yeah, I do like to communicate a lot of the milestones I get the great opportunity to work on. So a lot of times after I would do something at Shell, a big program, companies like Shell spend a lot of money to do big transformations. And there's a lot of learnings out of those that can be shared across industry. So for example, I led a global re-engineering, if you will, of our competence management system in Shell. And I published an article in the Journal of Petroleum Engineering. And it was great because in that community of oil and gas people, I would often see my work represented in conferences and other organizations that might not have had the deep pockets of Shell picking up that intellectual capital. So I'm a big believer in kind of sharing intellectual capital because I've always learned as a leader, you can always have the information, but it comes down to your specific competence of what you can do with it. So I could always tell a lot of people, well, this is what makes us distinctive at Shell, but you might not be able to do it the same way at your enterprise because your context is different. So it's one thing to have information or to have a skill, but to be able to apply that skill within various contexts, that's the big challenge of leadership. And I will tell you one other thing that I learned in leadership early on. One of the times I was working in the produce shop and I had a manager, and this is one of my big first learning in a lot of this blue collar work that leaders really had power and they really had the control. We would work shift work. And one of the things I called it the Great Banana Incident. And I actually found this. I was going through some papers after I moved a couple of weeks ago. And I found this write up. It was a big yellow sheet that my manager had written me up. And the basic thing was he said that I didn't uncover the bananas in the boxes and they spoiled. Well, if you know anything about banana boxes, they keep plastic on them when they ship them, but that plastic traps moisture and heat and it leads to faster ripening and spoilage. Well, I did that, but my manager had over ordered bananas. So the bananas that we had, we couldn't sell and they were going bad. So his way to get out of it was to blame me for not managing the execution of the bananas properly. So that was one of the first experiences I had. And was that good leadership or was that bad leadership? And I also had a lot of other incidents like that in other industrial settings. So I always thought that was really interesting to get into that kind of space.
So yeah, it's a actually really quite cool question because I was going to ask you actually, is it good leadership or is it bad leadership? In fact, is it leadership at all? Would you call that leadership and blaming others and pointing the finger at others to cover your own mistakes? Would you call it good
Right.
leadership?
And I would
Bad
call
leadership?
that management. The gentleman was managing his work outputs, and I was just a vehicle in the process of an output. So at the end of the day, the manager was wanted to be accountable for good outputs. And that was what he was protecting, his ability to be perceived as providing good outputs.
Yeah, I'm obviously like,
That's
is
right.
that good leadership versus bad management? Right? It's yeah, yeah, yeah,
Well, but it also summarizes in this little capsule this whole idea that we had, and I'll talk a little bit more. I want to talk about the history of what I've seen in leadership, but it's this idea where leaders or management and employees were always them against us. And I'll
yeah.
talk a little bit more about how that is shaped. But that was one of the first things is you've got people in power positions and they have one set and then the people without the power that are doing the work have another set. And this is why we got these things called HR advocates for people in the 80s and 90s and things like that. But anyways, just to close off, so what I got into when I first started working was really a lot of leadership of enterprise initiatives and areas. Things like managing quality management councils or corporate productivity management or performance management systems, a lot of things where I had to lead through a variable network and lead through influence. And then I eventually, from that, I did a lot of work in the area of competence and leadership competence. And then throughout my time in Shell, I grew up through that leadership pipeline.
Mm. When you say lead through influence, and I've got other questions for you as well later on, but a lead through influence, what does that mean for you?
Well, it means having all your facts together that influence people. There's a book by Robert Cialdini I love. It's called Influence, and he talks about all the variables that influence people. Something like reciprocity. You give something to someone or you help someone, they're naturally feel inclined to help you back. Things like social proofing. If you see a lot of other people doing it and other organizations doing it, then it seems more believable that you can do it as well. And this is why you get this whole idea of benchmarking that occurred in the 90s and the early 2000s is they said, oh, if Disney World can do this, we can copy it and we can do it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that probably when we dig into kind of leadership competence. That's not always the case because just copying something and putting it in a system doesn't usually work because everybody's context is different.
Yeah, yeah, cool. That's very good. Yeah. Now, talking about leadership, how did you actually get into leadership?
So I got into it where I was really always in Shell, for example. I was always the head of an area, like the head of
Mm,
competence management or the head of HR data quality management in Shell, where I would have to be kind of a single person, but lead a bunch of people in the horizontals and verticals that had no direct link to me. So I had to really use influence to get people to see me as a protagonist for good, a force for good, and why any effort, why them putting any more in their bucket was beneficial to them. And
mm,
so I always had to lead with the influence of making sure people, I brought them along, they felt heard, they felt engaged, all those kind of things. So we were co creating that solution. And then eventually, I got into leadership of big groups at Shell. And it was interesting because I think a lot of people, because of my personality, I was very hard driven, tenacious. Had that Pittsburgh mentality of coal in the furnace, shovel, shovel, shovel productivity. And if you weren't productive or you weren't really astute or as smart as I thought you should be, I diminished people. And it took me a lot of years to shift my leadership style. But anyways, I think a lot of people in Shell thought that if they put me in a big leadership position, I would just scare the heck out of people. And what I found out is I was really straightforward and honest with people, and I actually ended up getting like the highest leadership scores in manufacturing. And I still have people from Shell that call me continuously to this day, even though I've left 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that that's the big thing I thought about. I always wanted to say, as a leader, I will balance care with candor. So I will give you as much care, but please expect me also to give you as much candor. You'll never hear me say something negative about you around the corner. And I had to have that serious conversation with a lot of people. I said, you've really got some blind spots. If you really want to know what people around there think about you and but don't say to you, here's what it is. And that came as a hard sandwich for a lot of people to digest. So that was my model all the time. It was all about human performance. It was all about what motivates people, how do they succeed, what makes them distinctive and stand out, how do we make them employable. And I always told my people, I said, my job as a leader is to grow and develop you. You know, I make you so good that at some point the system wants to try to replace you with someone better than you. And that's what's really hard to do. But that's why we always have to grow. And that's why you want people to continually challenge the status quo around people contribution, growth, and development.
Yeah, I like what you're sharing there because I think leading through influence is really, really important, especially when you just said the kind of role that you're in, whereby you had to have people didn't report into you directly, so their compensation and benefits weren't associated with you. Well, they think it wasn't, but I think it was because you actually gave feedback to people too about them and their performance. But I think the big thing here is sometimes it's that when we don't actually have the title, they don't report into us directly. It's harder. In other words, you have to be more influential to get people to do things. And I think you have to be a lot smarter as a leader to bring people around to get them to go and do what we need to get them to do. And I think it's really good. So, and the other way, Brent, I look at it sometimes is that when you go into a community and you're part of a community organization, it's just full of volunteers, right? And so you have to lead with influence there too, because they don't report into you. Totally different.
Right. And I think that's the whole thing. You talk about these, and we'll talk a little bit later about the models of the leadership pipeline or what John Maxwell has done and other thought leaders, the Harvard Business Review articles where they talk about new concepts as far as like influential works. Like I remember the guys, Michael Watkins wrote that article in the Harvard Business Review, how managers become leaders and those seismic shifts going from an analyst to an influencer and other such things. So I think that it's really important that you grasp what is leadership in your context and how do you want to build it.
Yeah, excellent. Now, this person could be alive or from history. Who's your favorite leader and why?
I just did a eulogy this year for a gentleman that was one of my first bosses. And he was a Naval Academy graduate. Right after he graduated, he became a U.S. Marine and went straight off to Vietnam. And he's actually in the book by Keith Nolan called Death Valley. And it's all about the summer offensive of the First Corps in August of 69 in Vietnam. And that was probably the hottest and most intensive fighting of the entire war. And he actually left that, he had two platoons shot from underneath him, and he won the Bronze Star, but not just the Bronze Star with valor. And that's a really significant thing. But, anyways, it was just about that gritty combat and the reality of what was life back then. And there's a lot of drug abuse, there was race relations, there were these shifting societal norms of people for and against the war. But, anyways, he came out of that, went into the Marine Corps, and I started working for him after he retired. And he was one of the greatest leaders. I remember I was getting my master's program, and he said, Brent, I want you to tape every one of your classes. And he would listen to those cassette tapes on his way to and from Quantico to DC. And he'd sit me down I think it was every Friday or Monday, I can't remember, but he would talk to me about those lessons. He said, "Well, I heard your professor say this. What do you think about that?" And he was always doing those kind of things. And I remember one time I was writing a real hot a memo because I was really frustrated. And he says, called me BK. He said, "BK, just don't do anything with that. Go home, sleep over it, and we'll look at it again in the morning and we'll talk about it." And we did. And I said, "Holy smokes, I'm glad I didn't send that." And then probably the other thing when you talk about well-being and care, I remember I had a surgery on my leg and I was pretty much alone in DC. And he drove from Quantico, Virginia to pick me up, drove me back to his house in Quantico to have Thanksgiving dinner with his family. And then after dinner and a nice dessert, he drove me back to DC at Arlington. And then he drove back to Quantico. So he did like about 250 miles of driving that day just so I could have dinner with his family. So that's the kind of care and candor and things like that he would do. And I think that's where I really learned that you look out for people in all dimensions of their lives.
Yeah, yeah. And sounds like he took you under his wing to develop you, to grow you, to mentor you. But, I love what he did there about listening to the cassette tapes, your recordings, but asking you about it. Because I think that's the big thing for leadership too, is for us to actually help grow people by actually asking them more questions and helping them understand things from different perspectives as well. I think it's brilliant in the way he did that.
Yeah, and that was funny. He would even borrow my books from my man. And I remember one time I was living in Texas, and this is probably 10, 15 years after I had left the DC area. And I get a package in the mail, and it's a little note on it, a little sticky, says, "BK, sincere apologies. I misplaced this book during my move, and I finally found it." Well, I had loaned him a book to read back in like 1993, and all that time later, he mailed it back to me.
It just tells you the character of the person, right? That's fantastic. He did that. The other thing I like what you said before about people's blind spots and helping them understand what their blind spots are, because I think a lot of people a lot of leaders don't have some discussions with people. They tend to put it under the carpet. They don't want to have that discussion because sometimes it can be a little bit sticky slash difficult. And I think it's really important. I think that's part of our responsibility is to help people understand their blind spots, but then also help them. No, I wouldn't say fix it, but also understand what it is and then move on from that to grow. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is the whole idea where oftentimes our strengths become challenges for us because we overuse them sometimes. And those blind spots, those things that we think we're so good at, if we did a little bit of that third party observation to see how it's really working when we're interacting with someone, I think we'd get a good view of ourselves. So yeah, the blind spots are it's not only that they're there, but they're growing because of the complexity of the world and the complexity and diversity of thought. And this is why critical thinking is so important for leaders today, so they can have an unbiased assessment and evaluation of factors that are related to people and operations and performance.
And I'm really glad you just mentioned critical thinking. My question to you here, there, Brent, is with critical thinking and leaders today, do you think are they thinking critically a lot more today or not enough? What are your thoughts?
I don't think they're thinking enough. I think, for example, we talk about like the US election is coming up and the country's really polarized. And I know, and I was with my brother over the weekend and we were on a long drive and I was listening to a new audiobook that was out. And it was on the other party that I'm not a member of, but listened to it because I wanted to hear firsthand their perspective, their point of view. Now, normally in the US, for example, people would be very polarized to say, no, this is my side and that's your side. This is black, this is white, and this is how, we divide. And not enough people, whether it's the US and the election or whether it's leaders and looking at ESG or anything like that, they're not doing enough critical thinking to really appreciate and do that appreciative inquiry to understand what drives the perceptions and beliefs of other people. And I always go back to it. I said, look, more blood has been spilt in this world over beliefs than anything else. And that's
Mm.
the only reason that blood is usually spilt because of some varying degree of a difference in belief.
Yeah, and I think the key word here is being curious. In other words, wanting to understand, learn more, and so forth. It's not just the US; it's happening everywhere that I'm seeing all around the world. But also in leadership in roles and companies that I go into, leaders are just not actually asking the question.
Yeah.
Here's an example: somebody may say a statement or say something, and I go, "Okay, so what does that mean? I want to understand a little bit more about what that means." And they're not asking those questions at all, and they're going to miss some things big time.
Well, if you look, we talk about this whole idea today, leadership is changing, right? Well, so what does that mean? And as a historian, I like to start and look at, well, the 1900s is really when industry started to get a bit populous with as far as a consistent theme across the country. And when you look at that, you have to reflect on leadership in terms of what I call this teacup model, which is what's the technological changes, the economic changes, the cultural changes, the kind of organization and political changes that are influencing or have influenced leadership. And just to give you an example, like technical advances. Well, think about how did the internet change leadership?
Mm.
How did mobile devices or big data can change leadership? And how will in the future AI more so change leadership? And I think in that early period, we had things like major global events, whether it be the Great Depression and then World War II, and then the 1950s with the mass consumer production of appliances and automobiles. And then the beginning in 1950s of kind of management studies, right? So we didn't even we didn't even really use the word leader universally. It wasn't widespread adopted until the mid 20th century. And that's why they looked at in the past, early people became leaders because they were good technicians, good technical people. They got leadership positions because they had good relationships. And a lot of times they got leadership positions because they had a military background.
Mm.
Think about that. So the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And why did the military become a pool for leadership in organizations? Because the military taught leadership. It was based on leadership of people. And a lot of people don't know this, but the military also developed the whole term and study of soft skills
Hmm.
and leadership skills too.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Really good. Now, I find that the world seems to be getting faster. Technology, I think, is driving a lot of it, but from a data perspective, from business, from a social perspective, it just seems to be getting faster. For a leader to be successful in today's fast changing world or fast paced changing world, what do they need to do to be successful?
Well, I think they need a changing and evolving skill set. So obviously, I can tell you the standard things. They need emotional skills. They need adaptability skills. They need skills in resiliency or technology adoption. And like I said, critical thinking and empathy and all that. But I really think that if we go back and let's talk about even leadership from the 2000s. So we've had 24 years, almost a quarter century. And let's talk about in those 24 years, what has happened? So we started 2000 with a lot of big companies saying our strategy for leadership was to do what they called grow our own timber. So that was the theme. But at that time, a lot of the leadership development was really on an administrative focus. It was teaching managers or leaders how to do the administrative or the skills of managing people. So it really wasn't about leading people, it was about managing people. But then we started to get in this whole idea of, well, what's leadership competence? What are the frameworks and the models to really define what are the attributes, the traits, the skills of a leader? And then you had people like Richard Gianoutsos. He wrote the book Leadership Pipeline. So that was the whole idea that there's a growth ladder for leaders where you start out as like an individual, just a person leader. You have leadership abilities. Then you might be a leader of teams or projects. Then you might be a leader of leaders. And then you might be a leader of business units and so on. And so what they did is they started to have programs for those segments to help them ladder up. And I think that was a good thing to do. But to get back to this, what does it do today? I would do a thing in Shell, and I did a lot of leadership coaching. Shell had a real problem about they would hire senior executive level people, and people would be out of the company within 3 years typically. And there was a lot of research done on this, I think, by the conference board even. And what was going on is I found that there were four or three major derailment factors of a new person coming in at a leadership level in Shell. And it was they hadn't built the big networks over 30 years that most of the people at their job level had because those people were all at Shell. And then the people that were in Shell that were leaders were looking at them and they says, well, I could have got that job you got, or my buddy that's been here 30 years could have got that job. You're an outsider. I'm not going to share with you. I'm going to test you to make sure you really, okay, you came from Exxon or BP. Well, let's see how good they really are compared to Shell or whatever. And then they would have unclear expectations. So Shell would recruit them and say, this is your role. This is what you're going to do, and how great it was. And then they'd get into the role and see that they were constrained, or the role wouldn't be all that they thought it would be, or they were actually doing a lot more outside of another company. And so all these kind of things. So I'd have to teach these people how to really do what I call competence-based branding with them, to understand what their perceptions were on entry into Shell, what were the perceptions of their peers and managers and things like that. So it really started to be good because it just raised the awareness of what you talked about earlier, these blind spots. They didn't know coming in. They didn't have the walk around the Shell building 50 times. That was their first time in. So anyways, but that's what I did. And that's why I do a lot of advocacy about this thing called whole person leadership. And there's 6 variables that I always use in it. And you always want your leaders to be very distinctive what they know or can do. You want them to be very relevant to what you need done, and you want them to consistently perform it. So again, that's what competence is all about. It's about you can do something better and more consistently with better results than the average person. And that's what we're always trying to do, is make these distinctive leaders. But what they've got to know is they have to be self-aware of these blind spots. So what knowledge do they have? What do they share in terms of giving other people knowledge that builds a relationship with them, that engenders them to other people? Because leadership is really about the relationship that people have with other people. And what people want in a relationship is for you to motivate them, for you to educate them, for you to develop their skills, for you to improve their self-image, and all those kind of things. So just to close it out, it's that distinctive knowledge. So what are you giving me in terms of knowledge that I couldn't get anywhere else? Why do I knock on your door, leader? What skills do they have? Do they have the right leadership skills? Are they actually distinctive in the context of Shell or Georgia Pacific or wherever that might be? Do they have the right motives to be a good leader? Is that really what their affinity is? Do they have the right traits? Are they trustworthy? Are they impartial? And then other things like self-image. A leader with bad self-image will lack confidence. They'll lack resilience or authenticity or the ability to influence. And the last thing with leaders is every leader really has a social role, just like every person does. And a leader's social role oftentimes is maybe to promote psychological safety, which is the 4 factors of psychological safety. These things like freedom to speak up, the freedom to feel included, the freedom to challenge and ask questions and things like that. So I think that that's the kind of thing that I'm going to see in the future of this whole idea of, as we go to this thing about AI and Society 6.0, which is coming. And Society 6.0 is this whole idea that we're going to promote a more sustainable, responsible world, more responsible industries. It's a society where people are flourishing both personally and professionally, and all the things are working together. So we got economic interest and technology and environmental protection, but you've got these things like ESG, and not everybody, not all employees agree. Other employees want leaders to really advocate and be a driving force, and other people say, well, wait a minute, we're not quite ready for this. So this leader today is having a lot more variables that they have to deal with, because it's moving from the static kind of model of management to leadership, because we're in this world. It's more about the shift to different type of work.
Mm.
So it's about the shift to more cognitive work, which means people need more free time to think. The more collaborative work, so you've got to let people work together and build off each other, and they have to be more creative collaborations. And we're not letting people do that today. Leaders still think today, if you're sitting there thinking, you're not working. And so there's a lot of conceptual ideas about leadership that really they need to evolve. Just like this whole asset thing, leaders look at assets and they smile each year because those assets are appreciate or depreciating, and they can write the depreciation off. We can't look at humans as they depreciate. We have to look at them as how do they appreciate. And that's that whole idea of how do we get people stronger? How do I replace you each year with a better you? Those kind of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great things that you're sharing there. You've just touched on it a little bit before from the employee's perspective, and I don't know if you want to add anything else to it, but the employees' expectations of leaders, has it changed? But I think you've covered some of it already. Is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, there was a Gartner report out not too long ago, and I'd encourage your folks to look for it. But they did a survey about expectations in work. And they asked workers, do you get clear performance expectations and feedback? And the workers would say, no, we don't. And the leaders were asked the same question. They said, yes, we give very clear expectations and feedback. Then they were asked, do you have the right tools and data and information to successfully do your job and do your job in a flexible manner? The employees all said, no, we don't. We can't work at home when we want to. We're restricted by technology or by policy or leadership form foundation. And the leaders said, oh, yes, they're well resourced. They've got everything they need. And it went on and on to all these things. Do you think decisions get made in a timely manner? No, we don't. Well, the leaders disagreed. So right now we've got this disparity between what employees think and what leaders think. And here's the thing. So as we go to like AI, right? And I'm a big advocate of the human work cycle. So this is what I do with Hexagon. I tell them and I work with them to say, if you want change to be successful, if you want technology adoption to be successful, if you want the leadership of work to be successful, you have to start understanding the elements and managing them. So, for example, the work cycle is somebody gets an assignment, then they get a cue to do it. Then they might get some information that goes along with it. Then they have to make sense out of that information. Then they have to apply that information. Then they have to do an analysis to say, well, do I need to troubleshoot something or problem solve, or do I need to make decisions? And then they need to either determine whether they need to escalate or continue on, and then they document, and there's more things in the cycle. But the old leadership model was leaders were all about planning, coordinating, communicating, and things like that. As AI comes into the picture, you're going to see a lot of the things in the traditional work cycle, like sense making or helping people point out information or data, analytics, providing insights. Those things are going to be done by AI. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see a shift in what comprises a leader's day.
Hmm.
So what I mean by that is they're going to shift, because look, today leaders, and again, I'll just knowledge of Shell and all the companies I work with. Look, leaders today are swamped. They're doing meetings, tons of meetings. They're doing projects, tons of projects. They're involved in all kinds of things. The time they actually spend thinking about the people, working with the people, just thinking themselves to be, what do I need to do better to be a leader, and networking, those three things should equal the 100% of leadership. If you ask most leaders today, they're not spending time on those things. They might be spending 80% of the time on projects and meetings and work about work rather than leading people. And this is something that I think we're going to see shift over the years, especially as automation automates the kind of dull, dirty, dangerous, and drudgery type work, and humans are tasked with a higher percentage of critical thinking, collaboration, and just creative work. And that's going to shift their pie chart of what they spend their time with. And so that's going to require different type of leader as well, because hopefully a lot of the what I call the junk work out of the anatomy of work, delayed decision, roadblocks, bottlenecks, hassles, things not coming together, miscues, missteps. A lot of those hopefully things will be eliminated by AI so that the work day and the work week can be more efficient. So, look, people spend a third of their day hunting and pecking for information.
Hmm.
They spend every 7 minutes they get interrupted. So you've got all these bad things that impact people. A good leader is going to try to remove all those roadblocks.
Yeah. Excellent. That's yeah, I think you've actually answered two of my questions right there and then about what employees are expecting, but also the future, the next 5 years of leadership as well with AI and other things too. And you're right, people need to be leading people. It's not about just the work. And I actually find that
Yeah,
sometimes too, Brent, is that they were the hands-on kind of people and now they're a leader and they miss that hands-on on the tools type scenario, but they are doing the leadership piece, but they struggle between both. You're going to say something?
yeah, when you say that, I look about like the future. And I always love to be a scenario planner, strategist about thinking of the future. Sometimes I look at it and look at it the who, what, where, when, and how, and like the future trends. Like we look at like what's going to be the evolution of leadership selection. So I think in the next 5 years, the majority of people are going to acknowledge placement or promotion in terms of leadership is outdated. So the idea that good technical people can be good leaders is, in my opinion, bunk. Especially a lot of the engineers and those types that have that affinity, they don't typically translate to become great leaders. But the traditional bit in organizations today is take a good performing technical person and promote them. I think that's outdated. I think you're going to start to see more schools and programs and accreditation programs that focus on making people just good leaders and they can lead anything and they don't have to be a technical expert to do the leading because it's not about showing how smart they are in the discipline. It's about how good they are in the people arena and the strategy arena. And so I think you'll see that. And then I think like with this idea like a what, well, we talked about this idea that advanced competencies are required, right? So we talked about the big C's, critical thinking and listening and creativity and collaboration. It's going to require that leaders have these human-centered capabilities. And it's not just about empathy. It's actually about what really is motivating the well-being, the health, the safety, the growth and development of their people. Because remember, you're going to get shorter tenure spans. You're going to get more turnover. People are going to be in 7, 8, 9, 10 companies in their career. And they're not going to be these 30-year employees anymore.
Mm.
So I think that's the thing. And I think the last two things I would say is, again, that pie chart. We've got to shift what leaders do. It's funny. Like one of the things in show I really tried to promote, I thought that coaching was, and Shell tried to develop coaching programs for decades plus, but leaders really never had time to coach. They weren't classically trained really in it. They might go to a Shell 2 hour lunch and learn session on here's our policy for coaching. But a lot of them just weren't good coaches. I always said, why don't we outsource all of our coaching to our employees to a third party provider? Should be unbiased. That way, the employees should feel free to talk about themselves as a whole person. So I might not say to my manager, oh, my wife and I are really having troubles and my son's struggling in school. And I really don't know if I want to work here much longer than this. I can't tell that to my manager, but I could tell it to an impartial third party coach with a confidentiality agreement. And that coach isn't really biased by the organization's culture and everything else. So I think that's one of the things we should see because one, leaders typically aren't good at it. Typically they don't do it. And certainly I'd give credit to those that do, but I have not seen a lot of the doers. And then the last thing is, why are we doing all this? Why do we need leaders? Would there be a time and space in the future that my leader is really my AI coach, or is my leader really my analytics that I'm getting from my actions through the AI systems? So, but you're going to see these societal shifts that all these things, like whether it's ESG principles, employee well-being, broader society changes, all the kind of upheaval that's going on with economics and political parties and consumerism and changing expectations about what people want in terms of more personalized, higher touch, higher concept solutions. So I think there's a lot of things that are quickly redefining what employees want and what organizations need in terms of the idea of human beings or bodies being leaders and playing that role, and taking a look back at where did we come from since 1900, this evolution of, well, we're going from jobs to task management to administrative management to now we've got some kind of structured leadership program, and are they working? And so we spent the last 25 years developing these programmatic approaches to leadership development. Are we really spending the equitable amount of time saying, okay, that's the programmatic approach, but what's the wider, longer term strategy that we're really working towards in terms of leaders? And I think you would even be able to say better than me, if you talk to the average employee, what do they want in their leader?
Hmm.
And if you compare and contrast that to, well, what do they complain about with their leader? I think you're going to get a pretty clear contrast on where today's gap is. And that's a good place to start to try to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question to ask and a great place to start as well. Brent, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for everything you've been sharing. Tell me, if listeners are wanting to get hold of you, where should they go?
Well, if you want to get a hold of me, you can always go to the Hexagon website, a Hexagon, what's called ALI. Just type in Hexagon ALI, and you can find me there. You can also find me on other things like LinkedIn and other channels like Instagram and things like that.
Excellent. Well, we're going to put that in the show notes, listeners, so look out for that kind of thing. And so, Brent, once again, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Dennis. Good to talk to you.
Excellent. Well, there you go, listeners. What a great episode that's been. Hey, what about good leadership versus bad management? And them and us is what a lot of people think about. But think about what Brent talked about, leading through influence and how that's so important, and having that balance between care and candor. What about whole person leadership? What a great actual thing to think about as a theme. But here's the last question I want to leave with you. What do you want in your leader? What kind of leader do you want to follow? Maybe if you ask that question and provide that to the leader, then they can actually develop themselves, and we can have leaders of the future that might be very strong and great. Hey, it's always great having you on the episode. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.